Hello everyone and welcome to this first episode of Science of Doing Science. I'm your host, Adrien Fillon, researcher at SInnoPSis, a meta-laboratory at the University of Cyprus. Each episode I will be chatting with a new guest about a particular aspect of the science of doing science. Today, I am with Zacharias Maniadis, the director of the SInnoPSis research group. Hello, Zach. How are you?
I'm absolutely fine. Thanks a lot for the help in organizing this.
My first question will be about a little presentation of you regarding your past, present, and future. The questions are, who are you? Where do you come from? And where are you going?
My name is Zach Maniadis. And as you said, I am a research professor at the University of Cyprus, and I have the great pleasure to have welcomed you among many excellent scholars in our meta-research group called SInnoPSis. But first of all, before we proceed, what is meta-research? It is the study of research itself. That said, let me tell you a few things about my own background. I am an economist by training, and I've studied and worked in several countries, which has led me to different perspectives about how science works, including Greece, Cyprus, the US, Italy, and the UK. And starting from economics, I fast developed an interest in controlled experiments in the laboratory to start with. In my first set of research papers, I was using mathematical modeling tools in the form of game theory models to try to understand and predict behavior. And soon I started conducting my own experiments. Early on, I was interested in reproducing results of existing literature, and oftentimes after trying our best to reproduce those results, we often obtained important differences from the original studies. That led to my curiosity regarding what can be the driver between different results in the same controlled environment. And in my effort to try to understand and make sense of these differences, I soon came to be accustomed to a local hero in the Greek-speaking world, and a hero, if you wish, of the new area of meta-research that we might have the opportunity to talk about, John Ioannidis, who had thought at the time in the beginning of the 2010s, who had thought about the problem for some time. And there I was attracted to the interdisciplinary field of meta-research. I have to emphasize that although an economist, I am naturally interested in reading other literatures, especially psychology. So I enjoy reading psychology papers and interesting papers from biomedicine. So I was attracted to that literature because it would be able to provide answers to important methodological questions that I had. And gradually,
what kind of questions?
As I was telling you, the main one being, after you start gaining experience with research, what accounts for the difference between results, but also other secondary questions such as how should we be conducting our experiments? How much standardizations should we have? I can even tell you something very naive. In my very first experiment, when I first got my data, and this is a true story, I was waiting for someone to step in the lab and sort of give him the data or to her. So I was kind of having a little bit the the prior notion that somehow someone steps in and double checks for the for the actual data. Soon enough, I realized that such standardized procedures are relatively rare. But it's an interesting question. Why so? So this sort of interest and concerns. So throughout my research career, I have been examining several questions, but soon enough, the exploration of questions in meta-research became my main interest. And I started gaining insights, ideas, and methods from literature such as biomedicine, and thinking about how these notions can be usefully employed in social science, especially economics, in order to maybe improve the way that science is conducted. But in general, I was curious about why different disciplines found these approaches that my colleagues had not necessarily thought very carefully. To give you just a small example, I'm still interested, and for some time I have been aware that as opposed to other areas of research in biomedicine, they tend to think very rigorously and carefully about the process by which scientific articles are basically accepted in the corpus of established knowledge, which is the peer review process with scientific journals. So we take this process for granted in science for quite a few decades. However, in biomedicine, they have often, and that was to my surprise and maybe to the surprise of many social scientists, has been the topic of experimental studies. In particular, they have been experimenting, oftentimes with the collaboration of existing journals and leading journals, such as the British Medical Journal, on alternative approaches to the peer review, even assessing how effective the peer review is. So, questions such as why have we not in economics or in other areas thought of this? Could we learn useful things? Could we transfer knowledge in a meaningful way? And these sorts of questions, learning from other disciplines, but also with an angle of how our own processes of generating knowledge work, is what I define, how I personally understand the meaning of meta-research. And so coming from the economics background, interested in interdisciplinary research, drawn into actual research in this area. And where this has led me now is to be able to materialize part of my vision in having my own research group of interdisciplinary scholars trying to attack important problems such as what is the best way for contemporary universities to adjust their practices to the standards of open science, for example. So at the University of Cyprus currently, our research group SInnoPSis is employing several talented young scholars from different disciplines in conducting meta-research. And I certainly find meta-research as having a lot to say regarding the role of science in society too. And this is where I feel that this series of podcasts has a lot to offer.
Thank you very much for this answer. So you talked about your vision and the way SInnoPSis can be linked to your vision. Before talking about the purpose of SInnoPSis, so how we can materialize your vision, let's talk a bit about the beginning of it. You talked about two different topics. The first one is when you found out about John Ioannidis' works. And the second one is when you found about how research is conducted in the biomedicine field. So let's talk a bit about these two topics, how you began interested in meta-science and what is the way you are interested in meta-science based on John Ioannidis' works and your interest in how it works in biomedicine and the link we can do between biomedicine and the economic field.
Yes. To start with, John's work was extremely novel for someone who had not been exposed to it before. Studying the practices of researchers themselves, studying, if you wish, engaging in navel gazing, so inspecting our own practices, and how that might be driving heterogeneity of research results and maybe differences of practices across several disciplines. Soon enough, I was also greatly interested in the very simple Bayesian benchmark expounded in several of John's papers, and especially the famous one, why most research findings are false. So this was an extremely simple idea, but very deep, and to some degree, during my graduate studies, I had underappreciated the importance of research priors in making inference and conclusions about what we learn from the evidence. So very soon, just appreciating the importance of a Bayesian framework for assessing what we can actually infer from an experiment or a series of experiments, that was an initial, if you wish, conceptual push for me to engage into such thinking. But very soon, as I was learning more about meta-research, I was repeatedly confronted with one word that the psychology community used, the biomedical community used, and even the ecology community and other researchers interested in examining the reproducibility of research results in their area. And that word was researchers' incentives. So that immediately gave a spark to my second interest, not only taking insights from biomedicine and psychology and meta-research in general and thinking about how to apply them and learn about social science and economics, but also how we can use the tools from economics to actually help the endeavor of this interdisciplinary community that has the interest of understanding how to better alter practices for the better in terms of how scientists do things. So incentives is the most important word in the whole discipline of economics. So this is, if one can say in one sentence, what is economics? It's really the study of incentives for behavior. So there was my second, if you wish, push into appreciating how oftentimes the rather rigorous and mathematically oriented tools of economics can be useful for meta-research in general. So these are two different directions for this ignition of my interest in meta-research.
So the purpose of SInnoPSis now is, as you said, a research group created to test how incentives can modify researchers' experiments?
I would say that both of the directions of cross-fertilization are of interest for SInnoPSis, both what the meta-science insights, psychology insights, hard science insights, biomedical insights on how to measure and improve science, or whether they can inform social sciences. This direction remains an interest, but especially, as you just said, the second interest of how rigorous tools from social science and principle among them economics can be fruitfully used to model researcher behavior, to understand how changing practices of knowledge production, for instance, how the potential change in the criteria for promotion of scientific researchers might affect the quality of research work. For instance, as I was hinting before, we are in an era where, partly also because of the previous results accumulated by meta-research, the European Union, scientific institutions, scientific communities have appreciated the need for change and the need for reformed assessment of the quality of research work. So now it is a very nice opportunity for SInnoPSis and similar meta-research centers to inform this endeavor, to formally assess how this can be done in the best possible way and its effects, because oftentimes we might be thinking that a policy or an institutional change is a good idea, but in fact it might backfire. And that's why we need rigorous policy evaluation tools, and that's also something that SInnoPSis researchers are interested in.
You talked a bit about policymakers. This is a very interesting topic because it seems like the public and policymakers are often a bit like the informations that the researchers create is not directly linked to the general public or policymakers. Mm-hmm. So my question is, how can meta-science help researchers link their findings to what can be used by policymakers or even by the general public?
Traditionally, meta-research has been related to the question of reproducibility, which is a little bit more narrow than what I think might be the best scope for meta-research. In particular, reproducibility means if we conduct an existing study that found some results, some association or some causation even between different variables in nature. Okay, is this particular substance associated with cancer, for instance? So we tend to study such associations in science, and reproducibility means being able to approximate as much as possible the conditions under which an initial study had been conducted and generally obtaining similar results. Of course, we will never obtain exactly identical results because of the inherent randomness of nature, but statistical tools address for this. A secondary question, which I believe will be increasingly important as we move on, is associated a little bit with what is called in the scientific community generalizability or external validity and so on and so forth. And it is of particular concern for the social sciences rather than the physical. And I would say a little bit less of a concern for biomedicine, but more so than in natural sciences. So going back to your question about policy, we believe that an open area of research pertains to the question of when is scientific knowledge useful, not only and applicable, not only producible. So what is this supposed to mean? This means, for instance, that oftentimes when we conduct a study, it might be very rigorous and very reproducible. So if other researchers were to approximate what we did, and we are helping them to do that by providing appropriate material for reproducibility, so all of these conditions are met. Nevertheless, it might be very difficult, especially without important intermediary steps, to translate these results into policy. There might be several reasons for that. For instance, if we speak about the domain of social policy, it might be the case that in order to conduct some sort of intervention in the spirit of the initial scientific result, we might need considerable political compromise, we might need considerable resources, And the important problem here is the so-called scaling up problem. Initial work by scientific researchers is usually at a small domain with a small scope with a small number of participants. And this generate an insight, as I said, that might be very reproducible. The big question is, under which conditions can we be relatively confident that when translated to a large scale in an actual policy with a different set of people who might be implementing the study rather than the small set of people who have helped the initial researchers, we might obtain similar results. So this scaling up problem, in my view, is a very important area for future research and for SInnoPSis itself. And then it underlines the important link between meta-research, SInnoPSis, and policy making and the interest of the general public for science.
Given what you said about reproducibility, the link with policymakers, everything we covered yet, what would be your personal definition of meta-science?
The study of what makes science useful for society. That might seem overly generic, but if one takes a step back and thinks about it carefully, then we might think that indeed these two conditions need to be met. First of all, what the scientists call internal validity, or if you wish, I don't want to get into this philosophical discussion here, so I might be excused by the purists who are hearing me. So whether results are reproducible in the small scale or as scientific studies, and secondly, whether these studies can be useful for policy. So in other words, whether they can be translated into meaningful interventions and how we can inform these meaningful interventions starting from scientific evidence. So
the scope of this definition is about empirical research, like meta-science of empirical research, when you produce a result and then you deliver it to the overall population. But since it's your work as an economist and what we're doing here at SInnoPSis is about empirical work, this is some kind of definition related. So
yes, I
get it. Yeah.
I have to note a little bit that our thinking certainly has relationships with the traditional thinking of sociology as a philosophy of science. However, being closer to the current tradition of meta-research as defined in the last few decades, it's more of a quantitative approach and interested greater focus in quantitative disciplines. That's right.
Finally, can you share a regret or a joy regarding your career, regarding SInnoPSis, regarding the experiments you're conducting, regarding meta-science?
Oftentimes, scientists are very proud of the methodological approach of a given discipline, and sometimes we might be hesitant to look into different literatures, and this might generate a waste of resources for science because we can learn so much from each other. So if one would ask about my particular contribution to science, I would sort of find it more into a cross-fertilization and into connection between different disciplines, which might not be necessarily very common.
So it's difficult to share the same language, like as a psychologist talk with economist is sometimes hard.
It takes some special interest and some patience for someone to think deeply into insights from other literatures and how they can translate, and maybe also a little bit of intellectual humility in realizing that maybe there's still we haven't discovered everything in our own area, and we can learn from other areas.
Thank you, Zach, for this interview.
Thank you so much.
You can learn more about SInnoPSis in the link in the comment of this podcast. If you want to contact Zach, you can mainly contact him through LinkedIn, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Science of Doing Science is a SInnoPSis podcast that brings you every 3 weeks an interview with a researcher to discuss meta-science. Our goal is to inform the public about the way researchers do science, its political and social implications. In the next podcast, I will be interviewing Zacharias Maniadis to talk about credibility in psychology. If you are interested, I invite you to subscribe to the podcast. Science of Doing Science is available on all platforms: Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Podcast Addicts, and Anchor. Please feel free to give the podcast a 5-star rating as well. It helps us gain visibility so that we can reach more people. Thank you all and see you in 3 weeks.